America, home of cowboys, land of McDonald's. Some love it, some hate it, some love to learn its history. The latter will be us today. Hello, I'm Sawdust, and today I'll be taking a look at the indigenous societies in modern America prior to European contact. Before anything, we need to talk about the reason people were able to populate America in the first place. Here, between the eastern portion of the Asian continent and the western portion of the North American continent, once lay the land of Beringia, or the Bering land bridge. People inhabited Beringia in the first place due to the decline of animal game in the surrounding region. In Beringia, Beringians found woolly rhinoceroses and scimitar cats, among other animals. Beringians became trapped in the landmass during the last glacial maximum, around 30,000 years ago. During this time, the Beringians' genome group split in two. After some time, the Beringians grew tired of being trapped and cried,
"Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall."
and the wall did tear down, or at least the ice glaciers did, since the temperatures were warming. As the glaciers began to melt, this second group would go on to populate the Americas and would eventually split again. Okay, now let's head to the year 1491 AD. The year 1491 is important since it's the last year that natives lived in isolation from Europe before Columbus headed to the Caribbean. With this aside, I'd like to introduce you to this map. This map divides the indigenous groups living in the US and the surrounding regions. This is because these cultures lived in very different climates from each other. There are 8 regions, and today I'll only have time to cover the Northwest Coast, or the Pacific Coast, or the Pacific Northwest Coast, but if you'd like to see more regions covered in the future, then please like and subscribe. As I am accustomed to doing on the channel, I will be establishing a few categories on stuff I'll cover for each region, those being geography / topography / climate, culture, and briefly mention some well-known tribes. Culture is pretty broad, so I'll break it down even further into stuff like food, language, customs, religious beliefs, sociology, and any available history. Without further ado, this is Native American societies in the Americas before European contact. The area that the Northwest Pacific Coast Indians inhabit is mainly coastline. It stretches from northern California through Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia, and all the way up just below mainland Alaska, meaning it's on the strip of land that technically still counts as Alaska. The region of the Pacific Northwest Coast consists largely of the temperate coniferous forest biome. However, the ecosystems go much deeper than that, as shown here. The Pacific Northwest Coast isn't super elevated in contrast to its mountainous neighbors to the east, though it does have some forest on mountains which are pretty cool. All in all, the area is just super beautiful with a bunch of green, luscious trees. The climate is mild. From what I can see, it's around that cool 10 to 20 degrees Celsius or 50 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit range. But of course, due to climate change, this could be different. In addition, the area is typically very rainy and has little snowfall. That's why there's usually a lot of ice. A notable ice storm occurred in December 2022 in Washington, where people were trapped in their homes because the floors were coated with ice. Due to living on the coast, the natives of the region adopted a fishing lifestyle, where the primary food sources were fish that came from the numerous rivers of the region. They mainly ate salmon, but they also ate other species of fish such as trout, halibut, and herring. Of course, there are different species of these fish, but I'll only talk about the salmon. Pink and chum salmon were usually stored for winter due to them having less fat concentration, meaning they could be dried and preserved for a longer time. This is why rivers where chum salmon flew through in the fall were desired fishing spots, as they could be dried and saved for the winter. Salmon such as the sockeye, coho, and the exceptionally delicious chinook or king salmon were eaten immediately, or preserved for short periods of time due to them spoiling a lot quicker since they have higher fat contents. Apart from fish, a lot of the Pacific diet comes from various plants and berries, such as nettle shoots in soups and teas, camas bulbs, which are vital carbs that are often baked or boiled, and soap berries, as well as acorns. Venison, bear, beaver, lynx, and small game animals are also eaten in the Pacific coast. Of course, it goes without saying that the natives hunting these animals would be a little bit more inland than people who lived on the rugged coasts who hunted sea mammals such as seals, otters, and even your whales. Unsurprisingly, the native population of the Pacific Coast did not all speak one language. In fact, they spoke many. The Pacific Northwest Coast region is actually split into 4 units or provinces. The northern province included speakers of Tlingit and Haida, among others. They lived along the strip of land in Alaska and some of northern British Columbia. The Wakashan province includes the Kwakiro in northern Vancouver Island and a small part of mainland British Columbia, Bella Coola in the central coast region of British Columbia, and the Nuuchsnuth, which are more along the central western portion of Vancouver Island. There was also the Central Province, in which the coastal Salish peoples inhabited. This included people such as the Nooksack, who lived in the northwestern point of Washington along the Nooksack River and just below the border between the US and Canada, the Lummi in northwestern Washington, more specifically near Bellingham, Washington, as well as in the San Juan Islands, and the Squamish in southwestern British Columbia. Finally, there's the Southern Province, in which the Chinook, Tillamook, and other smaller tribes such as the Wiyot live, along the Oregon coast and northwestern California. It's important to mention that a lot of tribes are named after their language. For example, the Chinook spoke Chinook. However, this isn't always the case. Anyways, I apologize if I mispronounced any names. Like with every other complex human society, there first needs to be a food surplus in order for a complex social organization to occur. The Northwest Pacific Coast natives were an agrarian society, so how did they obtain the surplus? The answer is fish. But we knew that already. What we're mainly concerned with is how were the Pacific Northwest Coast Indian societies structured? How did they work? Well, for starters, the natives live in what is called a house society, in which ruling elites hold control over communal housing. The people who lived in these houses, called longhouses, ranged from as low as a dozen to over 100. So these were some big houses. The wood used to make these houses was called red cedar wood, which was abundant in the area. To cut down said cedar, natives used tools called adzes to cut down a portion of the tree, and then they would put a fire over the cutout part of the tree for it to burn through the center, making the tree fall, making it easier to cut and strip the tree. There were requirements for families living in these homes, which were being related to each other. They had to actually live there for part of the year, and they had to hold a common title to important resources, such as fishing sites. The members would be ranked according to how related they were to the founder of the house. Outside of houses in northwestern coast communities, they were socially divided into elites, commoners, and slaves or war captives. The leader of the tribe was called a chief. Chiefs were usually male, but could also be widows. Chiefs controlled a lot of aspects of the community, including when to move to salmon fishing locations, when to build wires and traps, when to make the first catch of the season, when and where to hold the right propitiating of catching the first salmon of the season, and of course, external affairs. Regardless of these vast authoritarian powers, common people were able to voice their opinions over group affairs, since house members held equal ownership over the house. However, obviously slaves couldn't voice their opinions. Chiefs refrained from abusing their power because they realized that they depended on their citizens to maintain their power. Basically, they viewed governance as a mutual relationship. From biology. There was also high social mobility, which in turn made it so those in more unfortunate situations wouldn't abandon the society. We briefly mentioned slaves earlier. There was typically one slave per house, and rarely over a dozen. They were usually taken from their home during childhood, and they worked repetitive tasks, such as stocking the house with firewood and water. Slaves who displayed an unusual talent were able to be freed and able to marry into higher status. So even slaves were able to move upwards in the societies of the Pacific Northwest. I'd also like to take a quick second to talk about women in Pacific Northwest societies, since we haven't talked about what they're doing. Women's role in Pacific society gave them more autonomy. Salish women were childbearers, but also kept close ties with their kin and trade network, making them a valuable financial asset. Salish women also had a lot of maritime experience, as they would marry a man outside of their tribe, move in with him, and sail down the river on occasion to visit their motherland and relatives. Because of these connections, women became very respected in the community. Oh, and of course, they also did handiwork such as weaving belts and baskets, and some farming, so they still had their fair share of housework. Amongst the Pacific Coast's customs, the practice of head flattening really stands out to me, since it reminds me of Chinese foot binding, which similarly to head flattening is a body modification process, in which the purpose for the body modification is for the recipient to become more beautiful. This is the precursor to modern-day beauty enhancement procedures. The process of head flattening originated in the northern Kwakiro region and spread to central Oregon. Head flattening was also practiced by the Pacific's neighbors, the people of the plateau, which I'll eventually make a video on. The procedure itself involves binding a newborn's head to a cradle board with cloth or leather to maintain the desired shape. This process took several months, with the outcome being a skull with a more flattened shape. Usually this procedure was only done on children of high-ranking parents. However, babies captured from other tribes also got this marking, so having a flattened skull didn't always mean that you were related to an elite. Another custom of the Pacific coast was known as the potlatch. The word potlatch comes from jargon used by traders which meant to give. A potlatch always involved the invitation of one or more houses who would witness an event. Potlatches were used for a variety of occasions, such as marriages, the construction of new houses, and the funerals of chiefs, among others. There was some variation in the different Pacific provinces when it came to potlatches. For example, in the northern province, potlatches were done after the death of a chief as a part of the mourning process, while in the Wakashan and Central Salish provinces, potlatches were thrown before the death of a chief to bestow chiefdom onto a successor. Another big custom for the Pacific coast was totem poles. Totem poles were carved into different animals and spirits. There are 7 kinds of totem poles. Memorial poles, which are made when a house changes hands as a sort of ode to the previous residents, and that is also used to identify the current house residents, as in what their clan is. I forgot to mention this, but clans identify themselves with animals, so there's clans like the Frog Clan and the Wolf Clan and such. There are also grave markers, which are like tombstones. House poles support the roof of a house. Portal poles have a hole in them allowing for others to enter the house through the hole in the pole. Welcoming poles are placed at the end of a body of water and are used to signify the owner of the area. Mortuary poles are poles under which remains of dead people are kept. And finally, there are ridicule poles, which someone important who messed up in some big way is carved in, but upside down, to demonstrate just how ridiculous they were. Something interesting to note is that in every totem pole, a beaver's tail is crosshatched, and an eagle always has its beak pointing down. There are also tall totem poles, which you're probably more familiar with. They're the 100-foot poles that tell family legends through different sculpted pictures of animals. The word totem itself refers to a guardian that is respected, but not always worshipped. Speaking of worship, that takes us to our next category. In the Pacific coast, it was commonly believed that salmon had spirits and that they sacrificed their lives for mankind to be able to eat. It was believed that upon being caught, the spirit would go back to its home under the sea, garling its better down where it's wetter, and there they would reincarnate into other salmon if their bones were preserved and thrown into the ocean. Salmon could also become offended for various reasons and decide to not reincarnate, which is why the first salmon ceremony developed. The way this rite was conducted varied from tribe to tribe, but the most common way was to catch the first salmon of the season, then sprinkle it with sacred substances such as red ochre, then welcoming the next year of salmon with a speech. After this, the first fish were cooked and distributed to the local populace. Fun fact, in northwestern California, first fish rituals were combined with first fruit observances. Another fun fact, the Tlingit did not perform any first salmon ceremonies. Another religious concept was the idea that people could enhance their levels of success in areas like hunting and woodworking, to name a few, by seeking contact with a spirit being that usually took the form of an animal. This is where spirit animals come from. Personal contact was the end goal of what is called a vision quest. In the vision quest, young natives would go into secluded parts of the woods and would fast. They would also pray, and sometimes take hallucinogens. After those kicked in, they would see a vision of their spirit animal, their totem, if you will, who will guide them throughout their life. They'll drop in some wisdom, and it will be the young native's job to decipher what their spirit animal's wise words were. Sometimes they didn't even have visions. Sometimes they'd observe an animal and say that that was their encounter. This was sort of a ritual for the transition from youth to adulthood for Pacific Coast natives. From the vision quest, individuals would gain new songs, dances, and deeper connection with their spirit animal. Major ceremonies called spirit dances used these new songs and dances. Most of these ceremonies occurred during the winter. In the Wakashan and northern provinces, it was believed that ancestors who had gone through vision quests were rewarded with totemic symbols that served as crests. Displaying these crests and telling the stories of their acquisitions were an important part of the before-mentioned potlatches. Pacific Coast also had shaman, who were men and women who acquired the supernatural power to heal diseases through extraction of diseased objects, or the power to return a strayed soul. A strayed soul is when your soul and body part from each other, usually due to trauma or spiritual disturbances. Said disturbances can be a result of evil. Sorcerers use witchcraft to entice a soul to run away from its owner, to cause them harm. I also said that it could be a result of illness because some natives believe that your soul would leave your body when you sneeze. This is why today, when someone sneezes, you bless them. Well, it was also done in medieval Europe, so this is one of those things that multiple cultures practiced. Whichever way a soul might have been tampered with, at the end of the day, it became lost. Those experiencing soul loss felt depressed, lethargic, and all around nihilistic. At first I thought this was where the term soulless originated from, like in the context of something being bland and depressing, but I could not find any evidence to back up my claim, so it probably doesn't. To treat these soulless people, the shaman would perform prayers and rituals to entice the soul back into the body. If that didn't work, then the shaman would have to induce an out-of-body experience. Or some other altered state of consciousness on themselves to interact with spiritual beings in order to cure their patient. This is called a soul journey. To prepare for the journey, shaman would spend a day or more without food, water, and even sleep. Speaking from experience, crazy shit happens when you don't sleep for an entire day, but that's a story for another day. They would also spend an extended period of time in isolation and would subject themselves to extreme temperatures through cold streams and sweat lodges to induce themselves into an altered state of consciousness. Shaman would chant, dance, sing, and drum. Any of these methods work to induce an altered state of consciousness for the shaman and or patient. We talked about spirit dances earlier, and they're coming back into frame here. Spirit dancing was also used as a sort of initiation process for young natives who were alienated from traditional native ways. It was also used for nihilistic adults and youngins with drug abuse and behavioral problems. A healer or shaman, I'm not exactly sure if they're interchangeable labels. A healer or a shaman are meant to kill the disturbed person's old self. This process has 3 steps. The first part is shock therapy, which lasts 4 days. Patients are locked in a dark cubicle. Then several accomplices seize the patient, blindfold him, hit, bit, and tickle them, and they are exposed to kinetic stimulation. They're lifted and dropped, whirled around. This process is repeated for 4 times, until the patient is weak. The patient spends all 4 days blindfolded, and during this time they must stay completely still and cannot talk. They also have to fast, although they will be tortured by having pieces of tasty salmon dangled near their mouths. The second part of the process is physical training. Long daily runs, often barefoot in snow, daily swimming in ice-cold waters, and frequent rounds of dancing to drums are all done in this part of the process. It just clicked with me that when I first talked about spirit dancing, I mentioned that ceremonies were performed in the winter, and it's because it was necessary to torture the patient by having them run in the snow and swim in ice-cold waters. The third part is indoctrination. The patient is lectured on rules and societal expectations, and they're also told traditional tribal lore. Finally, at the end of the process, the native would take off their old clothes and put on their new ones, to symbolize the patient's change in personality, which, yeah, after going through the Tokyo Ghoul torture, I'd probably be a completely different person too. This process sounds like fucking Navy SEALs training. I found some history things from various tribes, like wars and some other things. Firstly, the Haida. The Haida were called the Vikings of the Pacific Coast by anthropologist Diogenes because they were feared by their neighbors for their superb seamanship skills, as they would conquer from Alaska to Northern California. Their war canoes carried 50 to 60 warriors. Other than warriors, there were 2 other people of significance on board of a typical war canoe, those being the chief who would lead in battle, and a shaman or a medicine man who would destroy the souls of their enemies, inflicting the curse status effect to ensure victory. The Haida typically took part in naval combat, but they also participated in their fair share of hand-to-hand and long-range attacks. Impressively, the Haida had built fairly advanced fortifications, as British explorer James Cook would find a fort on Graham Island, which he renamed to Hippa Island, he had seen in New Zealand. The forts contained several defenses, such as palisades, rolling top log defenses, heavy trapdoors, and fighting platforms that stored boulders to throw at invaders. Speaking of boulders, the Haida were big fans of them, since they also attached heavy stone rings to their ships, tying them with cedar bark ropes. They would throw them at enemy ships to make them sink. The reason for warfare is kind of split between historians. Some say the Haida went to war primarily for revenge, and others said that they went for slaves. Secondary to these, the Haida also went to war to obtain blankets and copper. It wasn't too clear the exact reason for wars, as wars would sometimes last for decades, and were fought over territory disputes, resources, insults, and even women. After the war, the Haida typically burned their dead. They believed that those who died in war would go to the House of the Sun, which was the most honorable death, which is why when a chief died in war, he was suited in a specially made military suit before his slaves were burned with him. As for weapons of war, they were bows and arrows, as well as daggers. What's a little more unique though is their armor. They wore rod and slat armor on their front, with greaves on their legs, as well as slats on their sides for flexibility. They wore elk hide tunics under their armor and wooden helmets. With this, arrows could not penetrate them, so they seldom used shields. Hell, Russian explorers later found out that their armor could only be penetrated by guns that were less than 20 feet away. So that was some pretty damn good armor. Anyways, now with the Tlinkits. The Tlingit people told legends to their young, known as raven tales. Most tales were humorous in nature, while some were serious, teaching morality and ethics. In the stories, there were two ravens, though storytellers don't always distinguish them well enough. One of them is the creator raven, and the other is a childish raven, who was selfish and conniving, and all around just a weasel. Though I'm kind of confused because from what I'm seeing, there's only one raven, though this could just be the result of poor story writing. What I mean by this is that it could be that both ravens have generally the same personality, or I don't know. If you're interested in reading one of these raven tales, then you can look up The Box of Daylight Tale, and that's one of the most well known. It's kind of like a creation story, which looking back, I did not talk about. But creation stories generally use symbolism to explain certain phenomena. For example, we have the sun because the raven was able to trick an old man of the raven tribe, whose name I won't even try to pronounce, into opening a box that contained the sun. Creation stories are just cool shit like that, you know. Before anything, I'd like to say that I am not a qualified historian, so if anything I said is wrong, then I'm sorry, please correct me. Now I would just like to thank you all for sticking to the end of the video. This was a fun one. I learned a lot in the making of this video, and I do hope to return to the Native American saga to look into other regions. If you want to learn more about Native Americans, I will list several amazing YouTubers that do a much better job than I ever will. Anyways, please like and subscribe, and of course, give me feedback through the comment section. Thank you.